Alrighty, welcome back to another episode of Retire Right. Per usual, I'm Ryan Wyatt, joined by Ron Wyatt and Nick Lewandowski. The three of us together are wealth advisors here at the firm. Nick and Ron specifically head up the investment committee as well. Today, the focus of today's conversation is just going to be around having a financial plan that we would say is painting an unrealistic or rosier picture than it should. And there's really several things that can lead to a financial plan not accurately kind of painting the picture of your financial situation. So some of the things that we're going to talk about are, assumptions that we believe should be baked into a financial plan. We're going to talk about retirement planning stress tests, what they are, why they're important, and we'll focus on some of the risks associated with having a plan that's not using good assumptions. And then we'll start to close out with how to tell which assumptions are being used in your plan. And then lastly, what do you do if you think that your assumptions are inaccurately painting a picture that, again, is rosier than reality. So with that said, I will start with Ron. Can you walk us through the assumptions that we've spent a lot of time thinking about that go into our financial planning process?
Sure, I'll go over the fun part, the returns, and I'll let Nick go over the inflation part. So what we do is take historical returns and make adjustments to them. So let me just give you a concrete example. If you go from the 1930s until now, stocks have done around 10%, bonds in the 5.5% range. So a balanced portfolio of around 60% stocks, 40% bonds has returned about 8%. Now, in our assumptions, we're using around 7%. So why less than 8? Well, number one, bond yields are lower, and number two, stock valuations are higher. So we don't make drastic adjustments because we're really looking at time frames around 20 and 30 years, but we make slight adjustments. So we want to be more on the conservative side. So the assumption should be realistic. Okay, first of all. Any questions on that?
No, I do have. Okay. I have another question that I know relates to the return side, but
okay.
Was there any other additional?
Nope.
So are there any other things that you think should be baked into the plan that could use even more conservative return assumptions?
Sure. Almost all advisors do not include their advisory fee, and we think that you have to. So in the plan, we include advisory fees, what would take down that 7% return even more. But so to make it a nice conservative plan. But on the other hand, our goal in portfolio management net of fees is to add value. Historically, I think we've done a very good job, and I think we can continue to do a good job, but that's not a guarantee. And so again, this, conservative assumptions, use your realistic assumptions, put in advisory fees as well.
Okay. So that takes us through return assumptions. So what about spending assumptions?
There's something that we do. There's a great report, and they came up with this term called the retirement smile. And what it showed is, let's just say someone retires at the age of 60. So for the first 10 years, they call it the go-go years. The go-go years, you're healthy, energy, you have money, you have this pent-up demand to maybe fix up your home, to travel, maybe a second home or whatever. So your spending tends to increase by around the rate of inflation. The second 10-year period, from 70 to 80, for example, would be your slow-go years. You don't need to buy as much because you have a lot of the possessions you'll ever need. Your traveling may slow down, and some health issues may start to arise that slow you down. So your spending tends to decrease a fair amount less than inflation. And so, the retirement smile, left side starts high, the middle of it goes low, the right side goes up. The right side is that no-go period of time. That's from like 80 to 90. And what happens there is that expenses start to increase, not so much because you're active and you're traveling. It's really because of healthcare expenditures. That might be medical, it could be long-term care expenses, but studies show it does go up near the very end. So we think that a plan should reflect that reality.
Okay, and just to confirm, that is something that we are essentially modeling in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Nick, I'll shift over to you. So, can you talk about inflation assumptions? What we're doing in that area within our plan?
Sure, yeah. So every plan has to make inflation assumptions because things tend to get more expensive over time. It's very important to do that. There's a temptation to just look at the consumer price index inflation number that is out there, that's the most discussed inflation statistic, and just use that, right, for the whole plan. But there are significant areas of a financial plan where different inflation rates are applicable. The one that comes right to the top of mind is healthcare. Healthcare inflation tends to be higher than general consumer price inflation. And that applies to kind of regular medical expenses and any long-term care expenses. The other area that's a really big deal that's easily overlooked is how you're handling Social Security in relation to in general inflation. Social Security gets these cost of living increases every year that are supposed to adjust the benefit for inflation, but they use a different formula for computing that cost of living increase than is used to calculate consumer price inflation, and it tends to be biased lower that conveniently.
Right.
So the COLAs for Social Security tend to be lower than what real inflation in the general economy is. We think it's important to model that into a plan. We did another podcast where we talked specifically about Social Security, and we think this kind of like structural tendency to have lower COLAs than inflation is one of the things that they do to keep the program kind of funded.
Right. So COLA, just cost of living adjustment, and I think that was one of the things that we said that they could actually refine further to shore up the system, is making additional adjustments to how that inflation is factored in.
Absolutely.
I don't know that I would say that the next area that I'm going to ask about is necessarily like an assumption. You could say that it is, but I think it's something more that we just like look at very closely. Overlooked expenses.
Yeah, I call it competent planning.
Competent planning. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think in my experience working with people about cash flow and pinning that down, there's just a tendency for people to compartmentalize their expenses, and I think a lot of times people in their own mental accounting get into their head, well, I spend $5,000 a month and I spend $60,000 a year, and then you're like, okay, well, what do you spend on travel? And they're like, oh, actually, we do take a $10,000 a year beach house thing every year, and you start to uncover these other things as you get into more detail. So it's just important to make sure you're not missing stuff because it adds up. And areas where we see stuff get missed, like travel I just alluded to, you just want to make sure, like on average, you're kind of building in realistic travel expenses to a plan. Some years might be high, some years might be low, but have something in there that's representative of the long
and we
run.
always say it's better to have it in the plan than not. Right. Even if you don't think you're necessarily going to spend $10,000 a year or more or less on travel, but if you think it's a possibility, add it to the plan to make sure that you can do it instead of on a whim saying, now I want to do this, and you find out the results aren't there.
And then we find it too that over, when we review a plan every year, over a 2 or 3 year period of time, if people aren't traveling, we can make an adjustment then, right? But start off with realistic goals, maybe a little bit on the higher side, and then as we see what actually happens, we can make adjustments to fine tune it.
Houses is another one. There's a lot of expenses that can be overlooked related to houses. Obviously, the big stuff like property taxes, insurance, HOA fees, you want to make sure that those are reflected in the numbers for spending. The big one that sneaks up is maintenance. Like that little maintenance stuff can really add up once you drill into the numbers. So that can be overlooked. Cars is another area. Just making sure that car purchasing is correctly accounted for in terms of the frequency and the likely amount that's going to go out for vehicles. A while ago, we were just lumping car spending in with basic living expenses and assuming that the basic living expenses will just cover car payments and outlays for cars. And a while back, we switched to building separate purchase goals in for each car purchase in the retirement portion of a plan, just because we found that the old way of doing it was not necessarily correctly capturing the actual outlays on the vehicles.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, then you can assign a specific inflation number to, what do new cars typically, the prices increase by every year, then you can do a depreciation on your car, et cetera.
And then long-term care costs, you need to be thinking about those. There's different ways of handling it. We have our own methodology for it, but you got to make sure you're thinking about it because it comes up at the end of the list.
Okay. I'm going to use that as a segue. The long-term care topic there as a segue into stress tests. So, Nick, I'll stick with you. If you could just maybe define like what retirement planning stress tests are and why we think they're so important.
Yeah, so this goes back to the assumptions thing really, because we talked first thing right off the bat about making sure like reasonable assumptions kind of based on long-term data and averages are the best thing to use. Then there's the individual client data as well. And that's the bedrock for the plan. But we know in the markets and in life, stuff happens, right? Mm-hmm. So the stress test is a way that we see, all right, if we start looking at like, what if stuff goes wrong or doesn't come in as good as the averages are, how bad does it hurt the plan? Does it hurt the plan at all? That's really what we're trying to accomplish with stress tests. And that's adding up to two big goals. We always want to make sure, pretty much above everything else, that a client can achieve the goals in the plan without running out of money. And then they also have to be able to do that while sleeping at night relative to risk. And there's, we're used to talking about risk in portfolio form, like can you withstand the ups and downs of your portfolio in the markets? That's one dimension of that. The other dimension of it is risk in terms of just the lifestyle risks, stuff that can happen within the plan itself relative to the goals and things like that.
Okay. And I'm actually going to put something up on the screen for those of you watching the video version of this recording, but I know we have something in our planning software where we can actually take it a step further and we can run like multiple stress tests at the same time. So can you just explain, what that looks like a little bit, please? Yeah,
so this is one of my favorite things in our planning software. I love using it with clients. And if the graph is up on the screen, I lightheartedly will call it the rainbow bar chart of bad stuff. And so what it does is...
The rainbow bar chart of doom.
Yeah, basically. And it reruns the plan, the probability of success in the plan for all these different potential scenarios. So we can model in very specific things, like what if the equity market, the stock market drops by 20% immediately? What if your Social Security is reduced by 50%? What if your Social Security is cut completely? What does it do to the plan? What if inflation's higher by a couple percent? What if returns are lower by a couple percent? What if your taxes are 30% higher? What if you live longer by 5 or 10 years? And so that's what that exhibit allows us to do specifically.
And it assigns a probability of success for each of them. And that probability of success is really saying, hey, say the probability of success is 95%. What that's saying is if the markets dropped immediately by 20%, 95% of the time you are able to meet or exceed your goals with your resources.
Yeah. I really like using this specific analysis with clients, particularly when clients are concerned about things going on politically or with the markets, because it takes us back to the concrete facts of their plan. And I have found every time I use it, it makes people feel better, generally speaking. It makes that a lot more of a constructive discussion than it is to just say like, well, look into my crystal ball, what's going to happen with taxes in the future or something like that.
Nick, anything else that you want to cover with stress tests?
Yeah, we do a long-term care stress test as well. I alluded to long-term care expenses before. We could do a whole episode on like why we do what we do related to long-term care. Maybe we should do that in the future again. But suffice it to say that we don't do that on this stress test chart that we looked at. We run a separate retirement scenario, basically puts a whole bunch of long-term care expenses on the end of the plan just to see if it breaks the plan. And what we're trying to do there is just identify, like, do we have to look at an insurance solution for long-term care, or does the client more than likely have the ability to self-insure in long-term care?
Yeah, and the scenario that we use, again, we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details of it, but it's a pretty unrealistic scenario.
Very conservative.
And it allows us to say, if something like this happened, can they fund the entire scenario? Which in that case, we would say self-insuring makes sense. Or it'll allow us to quantify, essentially how many years they would be able to fund that, that type of scenario. So it's a pretty powerful tool.
Schedule your complimentary review with Ryan and his team today. Just visit them online at wyzewealthadvisors.com or call 724-271-7019 to get started. That's 724-271-7019 to get started.
All right, Ron, we'll start to close it out. The question I have for you here is, it's a basic question, but how do you know if you have a good financial plan with good assumptions?
It can be difficult. For me, for us, we can look at it quickly and see if the assumptions are realistic. Most retail investors would have more difficulty, but I talked about return before. So just reasonable, realistic returns. And let me just give you two examples. So back in the late 90s, if you recall, during the tech bubble, the markets were doing 30% a year. And this was one of the hardest times for me with prospective clients, because some of my competition was showing expected returns for stocks of 15%. And I was showing for a balanced portfolio in the 7% range. We had a client came in the other day with a plan from back then, and that's what it showed. I was very pleased with my assumptions back then. And just to kind of bring that point home, when the market after the tech bubble got so expensive, for the next 10 years, the S&P 500 did a negative 1% a year, okay? And now recently I saw some assumptions where balanced portfolios were assumed to do 4 or 5% because things were a little bit more expensive. So both of those, I think, are
There's
extreme.
no in between.
Yeah, just use something, again, based on history with slight adjustments, put fees in. That's very, very important. Same with inflation, as Nick had gone over.
And these assumptions, is it, an advisor, you work with, X amount of clients, Nick works with X amount of clients, myself as well. Are we the ones just, hey, I feel like this is the good assumption? They typically set at the firm level, or larger firms outside of Wyze Wealth. How does that typically work?
No, I control it. No, so what happens is it has to be set at the firm level. You can't have every advisor using different assumptions at one firm. And so just make sure at the firm level they're realistic.
And what if they're not? What kind of, negative repercussions could that have?
Well, what can happen if you're using bad return assumptions, if you're missing goals, like Nick said, is that your plan looks too rosy, just like you started off with. People may think they can retire sooner than they should. They may think that they can spend more than they can. They may think that they can, they're going to leave more than they actually will. And so, they're just going to get off track rather quickly if they use poor, bad planning in way of not having an inclusive list of goals, or these poor assumptions about return and inflation.
Yeah, and two other, I would say, downsides that could fit into that just come to the top of my mind would be if you're not using correct assumptions, maybe a goal is to leave money to loved ones.
Right.
The amount that you have at the end of the plan could be significantly less than what you were anticipating. And kind of a scary one to me is bad assumptions could put you into a portfolio that's maybe not appropriate for you.
Right.
You could be taking on too much risk, which is scary if it's painting a rosier picture, and you're taking on too much risk and spending a little bit more than you should be. That's a pretty bad situation. Or
right.
Maybe you're not taking on enough risk. So.
Right. And I want to add one more thing too, is that at some firms, what they'll do is, for a prospective client, they'll create a plan, and they may not update it for years.
Yeah.
The whole process, it's like flying from, Los Angeles to Pittsburgh, right? The plane gets a little bit off course, you bring it back, you bring it back on course, right? Small corrections. So we're updating plans every 6 months. And so if goals change drastically, if the markets change drastically, we're picking that up. And we want to make sure from this point going forward that we have the best plan possible.
Yeah. And then, so for our clients that are listening to this, we just thought this is something that we actually kind of maybe not as straightforward as we discussed on this podcast episode, but this is something that when we go through meetings with you, we are, letting you know, hey, look, your healthcare goals, they're inflating higher than your basic living expenses.
Nick's tedious questions about your cash flow have a purpose.
Exactly. So we just thought that it would be helpful for you to kind of realize like what's going on under the hood and to what extent we're really making sure that everything that goes into that plan is as detailed as possible. And for somebody, maybe you're working with another advisor, and maybe in their report they have kind of at the back of it, they have the assumptions they're using, and you don't think that they're appropriate assumptions. For us, it's a pretty straightforward next step from there. We just think it's time to get a second opinion, because this is. If you let something like this go on, poor assumptions in a plan for an extended period of time, that's when things can start to get away from you.
It's hard to get back on track.
Right. So we hope you found this episode informative, and thanks for tuning in.
This episode's content is for informational purposes only. Opinions expressed herein are solely those of Wyze Wealth Advisors, unless otherwise specifically cited. Material presented is believed to be from reliable sources, and no representations are made by our firm as to other parties' informational accuracy or completeness. All information or ideas provided should be discussed in detail with an advisor, accountant, or legal counsel prior to implementation.